Last year, the US hosted the Africa-US Summit. Only this
to scare Africans away from the Chinese government.
In mid-December last year, the US hosted the Africa-US Summit. Only the second of such, the last was sometime in 2014. And there was no question at all that the summit was meant to at least register America's interest in being a more active player in Africa in response to, the evident dominance of the Chinese. China is Africa's largest bilateral trading partner, and China does about $254 billion in trade in Africa. In 2021, we did about $254 billion in trade. China is also the largest provider of foreign direct investment in Africa, supporting hundreds of thousands of African jobs. Now, this is roughly double the level of US foreign direct investment, and China remains by far the largest lender to African countries. Chinese companies have also taken the lead in exploring minerals in Africa, many now in lithium, mining in Mali, in Guinea, in Nigeria, in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Zimbabwe, and in Namibia. Most African countries, as you can imagine, are, in my view, rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. China also shows up when the West will not or is reluctant to show up. And many African countries, of course, are of the view that the warnings about the Chinese Trojan loans may be wise, but are probably self-serving. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and the Chinese offer them. In any case, the history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere. And the preoccupation of Western governments and the media with the so-called China debt trap might well be an overreaction. And I would recommend to you a very eye-opening lecture by Professor Deborah Brottiger about 2 weeks ago. She gave the lecture about 2 weeks ago at the Jesus College, Cambridge. The truth, as she points out, is that all of China's lending to Africa is only 5%. I think she's, roughly accurate there, of all the outstanding public and publicly guaranteed debt in low and middle income countries, compared to 23% held by the World Bank and other multilaterals. Chinese lenders account for just 12% of Africa's private and public external debt. And the Chinese, as I've said, have always been there when the debt even cannot be paid. In early 2020, as COVID battered African economies and, of course, economies worldwide, China came together with other G20 members to launch the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI as it's called. 73 low-income countries benefited from the suspension of principal and interest payments through the DSSI. Chinese banks provided 63% of the total debt relief, while it only owed 30% of the debt service payments that were due. So, by and large, in the arguments about Chinese, how, the Chinese debt trap, as sometimes called, and the large amounts of loans to African countries, etc. I think that what is clear is that the Chinese have proved to be, by and large, quite responsible in their approach to the giving of this loan. Of course, there are always arguments about whether or not you get the very best deal all the time.
Don't go yet. Before you go, I need to show you something that is very, very important. So, have a look at this. This data is from the World Bank, and what it shows you essentially is the interest rate at which different countries get loan from World Bank. So what you are seeing in front of you now is for Nigeria. According to this data, in 1990, Nigeria was paying whooping 25.3% interest on its World Bank loan.
Really? Really?
This $49 security camera created by two Australian engineers is disrupting the video surveillance.
In 1993, Nigeria was paying 31.6% interest on its World Bank loan. In 2002, Nigeria was paying 24.8% interest on its World Bank loan.
You don't mean it.
Even when the interest rate from the World Bank goes down in 2020, probably due to COVID-19, Nigeria was still paying more than 30% interest on its loan. Now pay attention, because what I'm about to show you is very important. According to this document, which you can get from the website of the Nigerian Ministry of Finance, the first time Nigeria got a loan from China was in March, to be specific, March 27th, 2002. And the interest rate, this is where I'm going, so pay attention. The interest rate on this loan was only 6%.
See the difference?
There is even more to it, because between 2002 and 2019, Nigeria took a total of about 17 loans from China, which gave us like 5.6 billion in the total worth of the loan. And guess what? For all of this loan, Nigeria was paying between 2.5% and 3.5% interest on the loan. The reason why I show you this data is because I want you to compare what an average African country is getting from the Western world, World Bank, IMF, or whatever, versus what these countries are getting from China. I mean, if somebody asks you to come and take a loan at 24% interest rate, and another person asks you to come and take the same loan at 2.5% interest rate, you can compare the two and tell me which you think makes sense.
Now I understand.
It is very important that you as an African think about these two comparisons, because in recent years you must have been hearing about the Chinese debt trap for Africa.
Concerns remain over alleged debt traps.
By 2019, China owned 21% of Kenya's foreign debt and 72% of their bilateral debt. In other words, the debt trap is locked and loaded.
Vieles, was an chinesischer Hilfe zwischen Gänsefüßen in Afrika fließt, massiv zur zukünftigen Verschuldung afrikanischer Staaten beiträgt. Dies passiert im Zusammenhang Africa, Europa eben nicht.
In the previous clip I showed you, the Vice President of Nigeria said the reason why America and the Western world keep on warning Africa about China and the Chinese loan is for their own, self-interest.
Many African countries, of course, are of the view that the warnings about the Chinese Trojan loans may be wise, but are probably self-serving.
While you may hear for a million times about Chinese debt trap, Chinese debt trap, Chinese debt trap in Africa, what the Western media or America will not tell you is that the real debt trap that many African countries are into right now was created by IMF, World Bank, and America. For example, on April 19, 2018, the Financial Times published this report. This report is about debt crisis in Africa, and if you scroll down to the 5th paragraph of the report, you will read it. Why debt ratios are still below the level that led to HIPC, the risks are higher because much of the debt is on commercial terms. Now pay attention to the next statement. With higher interest rates, shorter maturity, and more unpredictable lender behavior. What do you think Financial Times was talking about here? Well, in the same report, Financial Times mentioned IMF, World Bank, and all the Western organizations and accused them of making Africa to go deeper and deeper in debt. That was in 2018. One other thing that will surprise you is, in this entire publication, the word China was never mentioned. Meaning, as of 2018, everybody in the world knew that if Africa was having debt crisis, you should ask World Bank, IMF, or America, or Western organization, which gave us debt with 31% interest rate. But suddenly, from year 2000, everybody, it is now China. China that started giving loan to Africa yesterday, China suddenly becomes the person that wants to destroy Africa, not the Western organization that have been giving loans to Africa with 33% interest rate and destructive conditions.
The history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere.
I mean, if truly China was in Africa to do what is worse than what United States and the Western countries have been doing for the past 7 decades, then why did China forgive African loans? When COVID-19 hit in 2020 and many African countries couldn't pay their loan, China forgave 23 different loans for 17 African countries. That is after China had cancelled 3.4 billion worth of debt for Africa. If you are interested in knowing how much evil the Western world had done to Africa, all you have to do is to read this book or listen to its author.
I stood in front of the Shah of Iran, presidents of Indonesia, Ecuador, Panama, members of the Royal House of Saudi Arabia, and I said something like, in this hand, I have millions of dollars for you and your friends if you play our game. In this hand, I have a gun, in case you decide not to. I would go to countries with resources our corporations covet, like oil. I'd arrange a huge loan to those countries from the World Bank or sister organizations, but the money wouldn't actually go to the country. It would go to our corporations, Bechtel, Halliburton, Brown and Root, familiar names, to build big infrastructure projects in those countries and incidentally make huge profits in the process. They'd build power plants and industrial parks, things that would benefit a few wealthy families in the country, the ones that own the industries. But the majority of the people would suffer. They would be left holding a huge debt they couldn't repay. So we go back and say, since you can't pay your debt, sell your resource, oil or whatever, real cheap to our corporations. Privatize. Sell your utilities, your schools, your jails, everything like that to our corporations. And Claudine also told me that if the leaders of these countries refuse my offer, people she called jackals would be right behind me.
The guy you just listened to now, which happened to be the author of the book I mentioned earlier, worked in an organization built by the United States, the World Bank, and their work was to go to poor nations. They go to poor nations and push loans with crazy interest that they know that these countries cannot repay. Then when they give you $5 billion, $20 billion with some crazy interest, in the next few years,